The 7 intellectual traits in critical thinking are to be constantly developed in the critical thinker by the application of the intellectual standards on both the thinking of the thinker and those he or she may encounter. The intellectual traits really are an approach to critical thinking. They are the ethics of critical thinking skills. According to Dr. Linder, critical thinking without ethics creates a great deal of problems in the world. The intellectual traits are these ethics. But what are these intellectual traits? How do they relate to one another? And how do Erich Fromm's ideas exemplify or support this ethical system that underlies critical thinking theory? We would like to submit to you that both his ideas and thinking expressed through those ideas are consistent with the 7 valuable intellectual traits. Fromm says that the basic urge of man is to cooperate with others and belong to a society. Dr. Linder says that critical thinking is to be used for the betterment of society. The interests of the critical thinking foundation and Fromm are linked. In both of Fromm's early books, he identifies unhelpful traits that hinder our thinking and further hurt society. In Fromm's first work, Escape from Freedom, he articulates some of the problems that occur in a society in which the majority of individuals are devoid of key intellectual traits. Through the subject of freedom and the exploration of man in light of the rise of Nazism, Fromm came up with 3 basic personality types and the problems that arise from each kind of thought. Though all could be evaluated in light of critical thinking theory, the one that appears most frequently at odds with that theory is the conformist. Fromm says that this person is one that incorporates the normative beliefs and thought processes of their society and experiences them as their own. The person described is one that lacks intellectual courage and integrity. Given that the person passively adopts thinking rather than critically creating their own, they've not only hindered the genuine free thinking of themselves, but also have made it harder for genuine free thinking to occur in their society. For example, it's much harder for a person to be intellectually empathetic if the person they're talking to is not clear-minded. In Fromm's To Have or to Be, he talks about the dangers of the having mode and the supremacy of what he calls the being mode. Though the language is different, the parallel to the intellectual traits is apparent. Fromm says that if 2 people regard their knowledge as something they own or have, it becomes characterized as something they can lose. Therefore, if they have a conversation of differing viewpoints, losing the debate is akin to losing personal value. The prospect of losing personal value restricts a thinker from exercising intellectual traits. The importance of keeping that value or knowledge becomes more important than right thinking. The alternative mode of being is advocating fair-mindedness. His mode of being encourages the thinker to be fair-minded, and this is the trait from which intellectual empathy and humility sprouts from. Also useful is Fromm's distinction between faith in the having and being modes. According to Fromm, quote, faith in the having mode is the possession of an answer for which one has no rational proof, end quote. He says that it is an entry ticket to join a group of people and relieves one the hard task of thinking for oneself. Here, Fromm is denouncing intellectual cowardice that leads to conformity and later consistently encourages the thinking for oneself. This is a clear call to intellectual courage, integrity, and faith in reason. Faith in reason as an intellectual trait is supported by Fromm in this same book. According to him, faith in reason is an example of faith in the being mode. He further clarifies by stating faith in the being mode is a faith based on previous evidence. Quote, my faith in myself, in another in humankind, in our capacity to become fully human, also implies certainty. But certainty based on my own experience and not on my submission to an authority that dictates a certain belief. End quote. The trait of faith in reason is a trait based on the evidence that the world is indeed rational. The evidence is that we reason every day. Our experience in the world shows us that we can trust in reason, and therefore the faith we have in it is reasonable. It's the kind of faith you use when you trust a man's character based off his past actions, or the faith that leads you to believe that when you drop something, it will fall. In a reasonable world that is rational, faith in that reason becomes reasonable.
Going back to the topic of human nature, both psychoanalysis of religion and the art of living incorporate Fromm's idea of human nature. Though Fromm was raised in a Jewish family, he didn't fully accept his religious ideas. Fromm instead believed that as humans, we seek both a loving partner and a loving God. His book, Psychoanalysis of Religion, aimed to explain why people are religious. Fromm concludes his analysis by saying that people choose to believe in a God for comfort from their fear of the unknown. The Art of Loving is a book that was published in 1956 that uses theories from some of Fromm's previous works. For example, Escape from Freedom deals with the same theory of human nature as The Art of Loving. Many of Fromm's writings showed he had an interest in human nature, especially speaking a great deal about love. Fromm shows intellectual courage when confronting the idea of falling in love by challenging an idea that at its time was widely accepted by a majority of society. He argued that love was a skill that can be developed through practice rather than a seemingly magic connection that was destined to be. This idea of learning how to love goes against the thoughts of the Western societies of the time, but Fromm's analysis of the opposing side's views showed fair-mindedness because, though he did not agree, his bias wasn't present in his analysis of Western society's views on love. According to Fromm, before one can learn to love someone, one must first love yourself. To love yourself, you must show true humility, which in turn requires one to have intellectual humility by requiring not only the recognition of your egocentrism, but the ability to see past it. The next step to learning how to love is to love everything around you. What does Fromm mean by loving everything around you? Well, you must love anything that makes up who you are, be it friends, family, or nature. After figuring out how to love yourself and the things around us, Fromm says we can then learn to love a partner. To truly love someone, one must first empathize with their partner by putting themselves in their partner's position. Intellectual empathy is vital to a relationship because it is important to understand the other person's viewpoint when making any decision related to the relationship.
In conclusion, Fromm clearly portrays the intellectual traits through his major and minor works: The Art of Loving, Escape from Freedom, Psychoanalysis of Religion, and To Have or To Be. Through his use of the intellectual traits, Fromm was able to show his critical thinking process by identifying how he thinks the thinker should think. In The Art of Loving, Fromm stresses the importance of love, what it is, and how one attains it. The Escape from Freedom refers to freedom in general. He clearly emphasizes that people should not conform to society's norms. Instead, we need to have our own ideas and beliefs. In the Psychoanalysis of Religion, Fromm analyzed the reasons for why people today are religious and how people's religion impacts their lives. Lastly, in To Have or To Be, Fromm noticed how people in the 20th century let their possessions control who they are. He is an advocate of a more simplistic lifestyle and tries to warn people to stray away from being egocentric and materialistic. Through his insightful books and theories, Fromm is a great example of a critical thinker who uses the intellectual traits.